That's okay.
Wonderful. Our attendees are just now coming in, so we'll let them all assemble. Good morning, everybody. Buongiorno, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And good evening in Italia. It's wonderful to have everybody assembled here, and we are going to go ahead and get started in probably about 1 minute. Got about half our folks online right now.
So fun to see your names. I wish I could see your faces too.
I know, this is true.
It's such a good group. It's really fun.
Yes. And we even got a question before the seminar, which was the first time this has happened for me, doing many, many master classes. So that's wonderful. Great. Okay, let's see here. Good. All right. Well, it's 10:01, and I'm going to go ahead and start off. I'm Kimberly Charles, and very honored and privileged to be working with the Consorzio of Conegliano, Valdobbiadene, Prosecco Superiore, DOCG. And this is our third year of working with the Consorzio, which represents all the producers and growers of the region. Today, we are really going to be focusing in a very specific way on the different zones of the region and how single vineyard wines, the Rive and Cartizze in particular, help express this distinctiveness and the future of the region. And we're excited to be collaborating with Elaine Chukan Brown on this project, and delighted to have her as our main panelist. Everybody, I hope, does know Elaine, and I hope you saw the great news last week that she received the International Communicator of the Year from the International Wine and International Spirits Competition out of London. Is that the correct?
International Wine and Spirits Competition.
That's correct. Yes. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
We're delighted to have you because we know you take such a thoughtful approach to all of the writings that you do and the interviews that you carry out and the regions that you visit. And so we're really excited to have you here. And then we also have Roberto Merlot, who has been working with the Consorzio for a decade. He is an agronomist and a consultant and a specialist with respect to the soils of the region and all the different things that compose terroir. So, all right, I am going to go ahead and kick off with a little bit of an orientation PowerPoint, and we will go from there. So give me 1 minute. There we are. Let's see. Okay. Voila, this is the region. So a little virtual trip for you, and an absolutely stunning place to visit. So I hope that with time, we will be able to invite you to join us there. So just as a quick housekeeping item, these are our official handles for social media. We also have this in your attendee folder in our PowerPoint. Which will be shifting over to your folder after this. So you'll have all of these slides. We also have an unannotated version, which I'm happy to share with you after the fact as well. So please take note of these. And Kristen will also pop these in the chat so that you have them. We appreciate any and all support of the messaging and the education you're receiving today. All right, well, all Prosecco is not created equal. And we are here to demonstrate today, in particular, the region of Conegliano Valdobbiadene. And just to orient you, you fly into Venice and you travel about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the speed of your driver, to this region that's, of course, in the foothills of the Dolomiti. Technically, we're in the province of Treviso, and we're between Venice and the Dolomites. And then we'll be getting into the soils of this region today in great depth, but here the vine growing has really got historic significance and for the most part has remained unchanged since the 1930s. Specifically, the production area has 15 communes, 2 of which are the Conegliano to the east and Valdobbiadene to the west. Okay. Next. We're all familiar, obviously, with the wild popularity of the category in general. The base of the region, the foundation are the plains of the Prosecco DOCG here at the bottom of the pyramid. And as you go up in elevation and in really style and quality, we have various tiers. Asolo being also the second DOCG of the region, followed by, of course, the general Conegliano Valdobbiadene, which encompasses the 15 communes. Then we have the Rive, which we'll be speaking of today, really laser focusing in on the Rive, which are 43 different communes, first established formally in 2009 and refined 10 years later. These are very site specific and an area that we're quite excited about, and many, many sommeliers are starting to really learn more about, and we think a great opportunity here in the US market to help express the nuances of the region through these single vineyard wines, single commune wines, excuse me. And then Cartizze, the tip of the pyramid here, very, very special land, quite steep, 108 hectares, and considered the Grand Cru of the region. Here you can see the geomorphological layout of the land. This is called a hogback, and it is this hogback formation that really has helped create this region, or help this region express itself and be designated as a UNESCO heritage region. It is not just, obviously the physiological layout of the land, its relationship with man, and the preservation of, a tradition, be it agricultural, historic, art, cultural, that gives you the UNESCO status. This took 10 years to achieve. It was given in July of 2019. It is a very, very difficult standard to achieve, and we're most proud of the region for being able to attain that. And we will be talking more about the terrain as we go further. The UNESCO World Heritage, as I mentioned, happened in July of last year. It was in Azerbaijan. The Consortio arrived there to receive the award. And some of the authenticity that are included in this special heritage would be this hogback formation, which we'll hear more about, but it's steep, rugged slopes going in an east and west direction, with interspersed with small parallel valleys. The Ciglioni, which is a type of terrace that's covered in grass as opposed to stones, which helps prevent erosion and has another significance as well. And then the patchwork landscape, lots of small scale producers, many growers that really help comprise this beautiful fabric of a terrain. All right, so why is Conegliano Valdobbiadene Superiore? Well, we all know that high elevation winemaking often contributes greatly to quality. Here we have a range from 164 to 1640 feet in general, and you can see this beautiful dramatic terrain behind the vineyard plantings. The viticulture here is called heroic viticulture, quite steep. There is clearly only manual harvesting that goes on in this particular region. Here we go. This is an example of the pulley system. So, and many, many generations, by the way, are invested in the region. I'm really pleased to see that over 40% of the people that are working in the region, whether they're owners or laborers, are women. Many owners as well of the property. There are many generations of family that go to the school, which was established in Conegliano in 1876. It is the winemaking school. It is the oldest in Italy. And there's a deep, deep, deep tradition here where staying within your parents' business is something of a great honor and privilege. All right, and just a few words here on the production method. The Martinotti method was created in Italy by Mr. Martinotti. It is the parent production method of Charmat, which of course is in tank. This was created right there in Conegliano at the school that I just mentioned. And of course, it goes from the harvest to pressing, to settling, to vinification, to the prix de mousse, and then the bottling. So these pressurized tanks help, and the methodology helps preserve the beautiful aromas and fruits and delicacy of the Glera grape, which is the main grape variety within the region, as you can see here. All right, in terms of style, because today we're using what we call typologies to help illustrate some of the points we've got before us. And we'll be tasting a brand new category today, the extra brut. That is one of the special things to underscore for today's event. So these are their residual sugar correlations: extra brut, brut, extra dry, and dry. And then, of course, there's a very small production of frizzante and tranquillo. And it's interesting to know, because of the tradition of the region, the typologies really break out this way. Brut, the drier style, is 28%. Extra dry is really quite traditional, and we will see today that it's a really nuanced wine when it comes to tasting. So that residual sugar will be counterpointed, and Elaine will be speaking to us in great depth about that. And then dry, 6.2. A quick note about the two regions that we are focusing in on today. The Cartize, of course, as I mentioned before, is the Grand Cru. It's 108 hectares, and it's on the western portion of the appellation, and encompasses many of these lovely little towns, and has a perfect combination of ancient soils and microclimates. Really, really beautiful and steep, and a special place to visit. The Rive are 43, as I mentioned earlier, and these are on steep sites, delineated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that delineation. Only sparkling wine produced from the Rive, and all handpicked, of course, from a single municipality. So again, as I said, the category was created in 2009 formally, and was adapted 10 years later. So we'll be tasting 3 of those, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, and then lastly here on production volume, just so you have a sense of the scale and scope of the producers in the region, over half of the production is under 500,000 bottles, smaller producers. And then you can see the layout here of 20% between 500,000 and 2 million, and then 9% between 2 and 5, and then finally 20% over 5 million. So this definitely speaks to the large number of growers and the large number of small production and medium production wineries. Okay, Elaine, I'm handing this over to you.
Yay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, so I'm going to talk for a minute. So if we could drop the PowerPoint, and we'll be pulling up slides that help us get a handle on the wines and the region and things like that in a minute. And I see Mary's already using the Q&A box, so thank you for that. If you can, we really invite chatting with each other through the chat window, but then also if you have specific questions for Roberto especially, please go ahead and include those in the Q&A, and I can keep track of them a little bit more easily that way. But I am going to do what I can to track the chat window as well. I wanted to speak just for a couple of minutes about the significance of the tasting that we're doing today, and really kind of give us some scope on thinking through what we're going to be discussing and the context of the wines specifically. So the reason I wanted to engage in this project in specific, I'm very careful about what projects I want to do, and it really comes down to if I'm curious. Like that's sort of my standard. Am I curious? And the thing about the DOCG that we're discussing today is that in my mind, it was founded on a commitment to both tradition and quality simultaneously. And what we've seen since its establishment in 2009 was that they've continued to fine-tune the way that the rules are defined, and they've consistently put future goals forward and committed to establishing them. So as Kimberly mentioned as one example, the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation, they recognized this is a really important region, an important tradition, and as such an important culture, and it needs to be recognized so it can be preserved. And so they sought for over 10 years to have that recognition codified by UNESCO. But additionally, they realized 10 years ago that they could be leaders in the world by establishing a glyphosate ban, and set out in 2011 and made a public declaration, a commitment that they would achieve that goal and help lead the conversation on sustainability. And so in 2019, they successfully eliminated it entirely and established a full ban on any kind of use of that in the region. Similarly, they've consistently fine-tuned their understanding of Rive and how it's applied, and of the typology or RS designations, you could say. And so we're going to talk about that further today. But the thing that excites me about this DOCG is that I feel in the world of wine, it's rare that we encounter a wine that gives us the opportunity to rethink the assumptions we've brought forward into the wine world and re-engage in a refreshed, with a new perspective. It's really easy for wine to get monotonous, even when we love it. And it's really easy for our wine work to get repetitive, even when we are excited by it. And in my mind, the researching the DOCG and digging into what makes it unique is a great opportunity for us to rethink what we mean by fine wine, and not only then learn about Prosecco DOCG specifically, but to rethink how we engage with wine more broadly. And that's, for me, the real excitement about what we're doing in the tasting today. What makes this DOCG unique is what defines it as distinctive. Its primary commitments are to aromatics. That's a defining feature of Prosecco, especially at this level. What sets it apart, I think, is a commitment to freshness. And we don't just mean freshness in the new vogue way of saying good acid, but actually literally in the sense of we want to drink wine when it's fresh. You could almost think of DOCG Prosecco as like going for fresh produce in the market. You want your produce as close to when it was picked as possible. And the DOCG is really, in a sense, a region that asserts that value as well. We want our wine as fresh as possible. And this, in a way, sets it apart from other categories that we tend to think of as fine wine. A lot of our assumptions that we bring forward for fine wine are really established by French traditions. Very much Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne have really kind of, I think, in the United States, established what we assume the parameters of fine wine to be. But what I want to ask us to do today is to step back and come to a fresh perspective with these wines, and to really, in my mind, they are fine wine, and they give us a chance to think about what fine wine really is about. And so, again, the DOCG has a focus on very much on aromatics, very much on freshness, drinking the wine when it's fresh. And I think of these wines as about friendliness with sophistication. And that's another thing, really kind of fine-tuned way of thinking about fine wine that I think is interesting. We want the wine to be accessible, but at the same time, there is a seriousness about it. So I see that as friendliness with sophistication. So in terms of how we're going to handle the tasting itself, we have 4 wines, and they really are meant to represent kind of sub areas of the region. And so we're going to talk about kind of the complexities of the region. And I really see Cartizza and the Rive designation very much as the future of the DOCG, because they're showing how site and commune specific this region really actually is truly expressive through the wines themselves. We also, though, you'll notice, have 1 wine from each of the 4 typologies or classifications. And we're actually going to go ahead and start with dry. So we're going to start with the Le Culture. We'll then taste Massatino extra dry, the Marceret Brut, and then finally the Adami extra brut. And what we'll see as we move through these categories is that it really is actually the site and the region that's driving the designation, the classification level of the wines, rather than simply a decision, oh, well, we'll make a wine in this style. It's actually really is truly the region. So if we could go ahead and pull up the regional map, we'll talk through some of the details of the region. So as we get focused in on the map specifically, you'll see that this is like a fun sort of splash across the geography of the region. You can sort of see the region, as Kimberly was describing, spreads west to east. To the north are the Dolomite Mountains, which actually are also recognized as an important area to be preserved in the world. It's a totally unique limestone walls going up to over 10,000 feet actually. And then if we could go into the next map, that is, we've actually created a Google Earth map to get a sense of where we are and what the topography and texture is. Notice that, as Kimberly described, we're situated between Venice and the Dolomite Mountains to the north. But really, really importantly, notice that to the south and east is the Adriatic Sea. So the interplay of the mountains to the sea is a really important defining feature of the climate through this area. The Adriatic Sea creates a moderating influence so that temperatures are never that extreme. But it also, as the temperatures move between the cooling influence of the mountains and the moderating influence of the sea, you actually get a regular persistent breeze and sometimes winds through the area as well. So as we zoom in with the next map, we're just getting a little closer, and you can see there those sideways, the kind of west-east running folds coming from the mountains there in the north that really defines the spine of the region. Importantly, you can talk about the western part of the DOCG, Valdobbiadene and Cartizza are there on the western side. To the eastern side, Conegliano, the historic production area of Prosecco, is there on the eastern side. And we're also going to talk about this central area through the folds of the region. So let's go ahead and start pouring the first wine, the Le Culture. And as we do that, we'll look at this map. Now, as I suggested, what I've seen from digging into the region, talking to producers and tasting different wines from the area, is that the choice to vinify dry, extra dry, brut, or extra brut is very much guided by the growing conditions of the site that the fruit comes from. And this is just a graphic that one of the producers helped us make that shows sort of the spread of the sugar at harvest on the left and the malic acid levels at harvest on the right. Now, the point of this, we don't need to get into the technical specifics so much. The point is just to show you how varied the ripeness and the malic acid levels are. You'll notice all the way again to the left near Valdobbiadene that Cartizza is not marked there, but where Cartizza would be, slightly riper levels. And we'll talk about that in a second. But if you look to the same area on the right, slightly riper sugar levels, but still higher malic acid levels. That's a really important point to bring up. So let's go ahead and start talking about Cartizza, having made that point, that again, one of the things that's unique about Cartizza is you do get slightly, again, very slight, 11.5% alcohol, right? But slightly riper sugar levels, yet the malic acid levels are still higher than many other areas. So if we could just look quickly at the vineyard photo, and then we'll drop out of the slides again. So this is just a vineyard photo from Le Culture, kind of standing mid-slope looking down the slopes of Cartizza. You can see how incredibly textured it is, but also notice how very steep this is. This is standing in the vineyard where this first wine is from, looking downslope, and you can see we're really looking down at quite an angle. The angle is so steep that we don't see a horizon line. It's quite a steep area. So if we could pop out of that, I'd love to bring in Roberto. The thing about, so I was in in the region a couple of years ago, and I got to go visit Kartitsa while they were actually harvesting. And the slope was so steep that I was standing in one terrace looking at the people harvesting in the exact adjacent terrace. And I was actually looking at the boots of the woman that was harvesting the grapes. So think about that. I'm about 5'10", and the slope was so steep that when I was standing on one terrace, the very next terrace was so much higher. I was looking at her boots. It's an incredibly steep slope. But Roberto, could you go ahead and tell us about the soils of Kartitsa? It's a really quite a unique area, and the key viticultural points we want to understand about there.
Good morning, everybody, from my point. And going directly to Kartitsa, we can say the highest part of Kartitsa is really extremely interesting, just because they have a significant base, rocky base that established the hill, and then there is that much of soil, which is just a couple of foot, let me say, of soil where the vine can grow. So the roots are directly related and connected with the rocks, and probably for that reason, we can, during doing analysis of the soil, we find it out a few years ago, a calcaric content really high. So basically, these kind of soils are so calcaric. And from in terms of managing, one thing that I want to say, not to complete what Elaine said, but just to give you an idea, in order to manage a vineyard that has been showed in the picture, you probably need around 700 hours per hectare, which is 2.5 acres, something like that. So the amount of job that you need in order to maintain this vineyard is really high, just because you have to do everything manually. I mean, there are any kind of machinery or something that can really help you in this way. So just to enforce a little bit what Elaine said. What else? The type of pruning is basically uniform in DOCG, and it's something like a double guillot modifié, which is a double arch that starts from the head of the vine and do like this, like an M, something like this.
So my understanding of that style, so since we're located here in the States, many of the attendees, it's common in the US to hear about VSP, or vertical shoot positioning. So that's where the canes of the vine go straight up. But in Kartitsa, they're essentially taking those same canes and folding them, curving them over so they make a heart. And my understanding is that training method helps spread sunlight exposure, but also helps with vigor to some extent. Is that right?
It is. It helps exactly with vigor, but in the same time, I want to add another thing, because it helps also to spread the bunches around in order not to close them all together, which is a damage if you consider the possibility to receive the sunlight on each bunch. If you have a multiple distribution in terms of position, it's healthy for the bunches, and also in order to receive the sunlight, in order to have a uniformity in terms of maturation.
Yes, great, thank you. So Kartitsa is unique as well in that it's an uplifted seabed, right? And so you were saying there's a lot of calcareous rock, and it's
and another. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
Another thing that gives us a significant proof that these soils are coming from the sea because of the sodium content, which is not far away from the sodium content that the soils of Venice has. So there are so many similarities on that.
But when we spoke before, you were telling me that the sodium content is in Cartizza is really significant because it actually affects the flavor and aroma profile of the wine.
Yeah,
Could
sure.
you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, it does. We have to consider that this kind of rock that holds all the vines and all the vegetative soils at the top is connected directly with the roots. These roots are going through the rocks in order to find out the water. And what the water does is to get these rocks a little bit more soluble. And in these rocks, there is a significant content, as I told you, of sodium, which is directly catched by the roots. So this is why normally we can feel this, let me say, saltiness in the wine when you taste it.
Yes. So one of the things to clarify too, James is asking, so the Cartizza has long been recognized as one of Europe's great and unique viticultural areas. And it has actually had kind of official recognition since the 1960s. But then as the viticultural laws in Italy have evolved, the DOCG definition emerged in 2009. So Cartizza actually has been defined as a specific area since the 1960s. But it's, in order to answer James's question, it's been defined because in that it's a unique land formation near Valdobbiadene. It's essentially kind of this scooped, very, very steep hillside facing entirely south. So the Cartizza area is unique in that the vineyards all face south, and they talk about it as this kind of scooped hand that holds the sunlight. So you can imagine the sun is shining right into those vineyards. And so it tends to be, again, you tend to have a little bit more of a ripe expression in the fruit profile, yet the area is so incredibly rugged that the yields are naturally lower and the malic acid levels are naturally higher. And as a result, it is very common for wines from Cartizza to be made in a dry typology or classification. Could we go ahead and see the wine slide for this particular, for the Le Couture? So one of the other thing that factors into the dry tradition coming from Cartizza, again, the malic acid levels are higher. And so having a little bit more RS actually helps balance the sharpness that would be felt from malic acid. But I just love this wine in that, as you were describing, Roberto, there's still so much sapidity. There's, that real mineral, sea fresh quality. And this, in my mind, it does not read as sweet. You can see it is all the way into the dry classification with 23 grams per liter. But I really see the dry category from Cartizza as a meal wine. In a US context, we're used to talking about wine with some RS as a dessert wine or an end of meal wine. But what I actually pulled out these wines and experimented with them alongside a lot of different foods. And this Le Couture was incredible with duck fried rice. That sort of salty, savory combination was so perfect. But also, if you think of something like a salty Gouda, the saltiness of the cheese is a perfect counterpoint to the little bit of sweetness from the wine. There is also a tradition of making dry wines from this area, partially because long ago, before temperature controlled tanks were available as they are now, the winters were so cold that fermentation would slow down, and a little bit of RS would simply be left when the wine was ready in the spring. And so they just retained it. And so Cartizza is very much a region of tradition, and dry wine is part of that tradition, partially because of the chemistry of the grapes and partially because of the weather conditions as well. So if we could go ahead and, Roberto, are there any last comments you want to add to discussions of Cartizza or the dry category?
No, I think we said almost everything. I just want to mention that we are talking about Cartizza, which has a surface like 108 hectares, which is 250 acres, which is not that much. I mean, it's just a small piece of land.
Well, and no, I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a very small piece of land, but there's over 100 producers making very small quantities of wine from Cartizza as well. And
one of these, sorry,
no,
Elaine,
please,
I
go
want
ahead.
to say something funny. The owner that has more land is called the billionaire around there, and he owns something like 6 hectares, which is 15 acres. Just to give you the idea.
Yeah, the biggest landowner in Cartizza has 15 acres. So let's go ahead and look at the photo for the second vineyard that we're going to look at.
Elaine, also just for a quick interjection, Jeff Kralik wanted to know about your decision for the tasting order.
Yes, I'll talk about that in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, gotcha.
And then, but also Kimberly Mary has a question on the kind of availability of Cartizza wines, and I'll let you go ahead and respond to that. You can type the answer in if you want to. But so we're looking now. Immediately you can see what a completely different texture the landscape of this vineyard has. And so if we could go backwards to the Google Earth map of the region. Now, we are actually, with the second wine here, which is extra dry from Massatina, we are looking at Rive, or a site-specific wine from Conegliano. So it's from the commune Conegliano, but it is a very specific vineyard that Massatina owns and has worked with for quite a long time. So, but no, you'll notice in this map, again, there's the kind of what I call the spine of the region, those east-west running folds from the mountains. And to the east here, you'll notice there's more of a sweeping sort of feel that you can see kind of east of the kind of ridgeline that comes down to Conegliano. So everything east of there actually was very influenced by an ancient glacier. So an ancient glacier moved through the eastern side of the region and carved out the landscape, creating a series of rolling hills rather than the utterly steep slopes that you tend to see in the west. But also notice as you, at the very bottom of the screen, you can see the kind of winding river that runs from the mountains around the area and off to the sea there that Kimberly is highlighting. So the interaction of this, the mountains in the north, the glacier that came through the east, and then the river that comes from the west to the south, is the interaction of these three elements creates incredibly complex soils through the entire region, which is so that each of these rive have very distinctive soil qualities, and that's part of what defines them as special sites. And so Conegliano here again is, rather than being an uplifted seabed, as we saw in Cartizza, Conegliano is instead a moraine area with morainic soils, so glacial influenced soils. So Roberto, could you tell us more about kind of what that means and what soil character we see there and how that shows up in the wines?
Yeah, first, you have to consider that this kind of deposit, glacial deposit that has been created in the centuries, created a condition of soil which is really rich in terms of skeleton. I mean, there are lots of small rocks like this that rolling and rolling and rolling became obviously around, as you can understand, and in the eastern part created let me say, a more gentle hills, because just to give you an example, in this part, we have basically 20% of steepness, which is not that high. So it seems sometimes to have like really gentle hills. It seems to me to be sometimes in Tuscany, somewhere in Tuscany, but the content in terms of I mean, the content in terms of soils is obviously related also to the marl that is contained, but you have to consider also the marl, but with the skeleton material. And in this area, we have to consider also that the climate is a little bit warmer compared to the western part. So if you remember the map that has been shown you before by Kimberly, you can identify a position which is southern eastern, which is warmer than the western northern.
Could you go ahead and go back one map? Yeah, great, thank you. No, the next one.
Sorry.
Yeah. Because again, just as a quick reminder, excuse me, Roberto, because that eastern side is closer to the Adriatic Sea, it is getting more of a moderating influence from the sea compared to the eastern side is more influenced by the cooling conditions of the mountains. So the eastern side is slightly warmer, as Roberto mentioned, but it also is directly influenced by that breeze that we described earlier. And so one of the advantages of the western side, you get a little bit more ripeness, but the persistent breeze helps lower disease pressure that makes farming just a little bit easier. But actually it also slows respiration of the vines. So it's this interesting little pocket where you again have higher malic acid levels. And as we described earlier, the extra dry designation works well to help balance what otherwise would be sharpness from the malic acid. Roberto, do you want to add any more to that? Yeah. Okay.
No, it's completely exactly. I mean, the thing is just going back to the maturation, just to give you a general idea, we can say that in the Conegliano and northern part, the harvest normally is used to start around the first days of September. Then if we go back on the western part, normally the harvest starts from 2 to 3 weeks later. So as Elaine mentioned before, it's strange that in the middle of the western part, we have this little piece of land, which is called Cartizze, that normally starts 1 week earlier than all the other rest that is around Cartizze, because just it's a small place, 108 hectares, which is slightly warmer than everything that stays around it. So we can just point this in order to give another information.
Yes, thank you. Could we go ahead and come back to this vineyard photo? So again, you'll notice, as Roberto is describing, these are much smoother rolling hills. There is still a slope, but it's compared to the drama that we saw in the first photo, it's much gentler. But even so, this wine is from Riva di Ogliano, so it is still a Riva designation. And the reason is that this has historically been understood as one of the superior growing areas that has very distinctive qualities in the region. And so, I mean, and I find the juxtaposition of tasting a wine from very far in the west of Cartizze and to very far in the east of Ogliano, I find it exciting to go between these two because the qualities are quite different in my mind. The speaking to producers and tasting through wines, what I found was that as Roberto was describing, there's these kind of rolling rocks, but there's also clay content in this eastern side. And what I've seen is that the wines tend to have a little more roundness, still quite like, again, notice, like I'd invite you to taste this wine again and notice how incredibly like mouth refreshing it is. It's an extra dry wine, but the natural acidity in this wine, it's like my mouth is still watering. There's an incredibly long finish here, tons of freshness from the natural acidity, but the character of the wine in comparison to the first is just a little rounder. And it's a subtle distinction, but the first wine, there was like tons of sapidity and mineral content, as Roberto was describing, and quite, again, palate refreshing. But now this one, it's just a little bit rounder in comparison to the first wine. So could we go ahead and see the wine slide for this one? So this wine, again, notice incredibly low alcohol levels in all of these wines, which I think is part of that focus on freshness. So it's literally thinking in terms of, you know, we want our wine fresh, like we want our produce fresh, but there's also, we want an experience of freshness in the mouth. And so even with, I think the US, to be totally frank, us as wine media in the US have a lot of prejudice against RS in wine. And part of what I'm trying to bring out here is that my experience tasting each of these first two wines, you know, the first one had 23 grams per liter, the second one has 15.4. I would not describe either as a sweet wine. And my experience with both has been that they're really fantastic meal wines. And so speaking to, I think it was Jeff that asked about my interest in the tasting order. I see the experience of starting with dry and moving towards extra brut as this experience of kind of ever further refreshing the palate so that we're getting fresher and fresher as we go. But it's also a way of emphasizing we can start with dry because this wine does have so much freshness and it's got such great acidity that we're by no means starting with a heavy wine. This is, there's plenty of freshness in both of these. In terms of Massatina, my experience was like, this is a perfect wine for something like risotto or whitefish, like really quite perfect for both of those. Interestingly, this was the one wine that Massatina actually holds old vintages of their RDO bottlings. And it's very unusual for Prosecco to be aged. Like, again, it's about drinking a new wine and enjoying it when it's fresh. But this is actually one exception. And speaking to them further, they actually recently did a vertical all the way back to 2009 and with this exact wine, and found that the wines, like essentially they got a little bit nuttier as they aged. But again, that combination of really vibrant acidity that's happening here with sugar, the combination is actually does very well for aging. And so this is actually an unusual instance in the region that Massatina is able to age their Prosecco and even for more than a decade and find it still very drinkable and perfect for a meal. Okay, is there, Roberto, anything else you want to add about this eastern side before we move to the next wine?
No, I think the information is, on my personal opinion, complete. Technically speaking, the only thing I want to mention is even when you taste the bunches, I mean the berries, in order to decide if you have to start the harvest or not, we do that as a consortium with all the places distributed in the appellation. We have 20 points, and one of the places where we can just feel even the saltiness is Conegliano, which is this town where this wine is coming from. So, I mean, even in the grapes, you can feel these kinds of sensations.
Yeah, no, it's that's why the Rive, I think, are so important, because they are partially focused on soil, and you can, like you're saying, you can actually see it coming actually in the fruit, the soil effect. So for those of you that are curious about these kinds of things as well, there's actually been, the DOCG has actually done extensive research identifying the soil variation through the region and then how that shows up in the perception of the fruit and also the wines. And so there's actually quite a lot to continue learning in that regard. But let's go ahead and look at the next vineyard photo for the Marceret. And actually, in a second, we'll look at the map again. We've moved back to the west, but in the center of the area. So we'll look at the map in a second. But the thing to notice here is, notice that we're looking through those folded hills that Kimberly talked about in the beginning, and that I keep referring to on the Google Earth map as kind of this folding spine at the north of the region. It's like such a gorgeous area here. This photo is taken from within the vineyard that we're about to taste. And again, notice we're back to talking about steep slopes again. Could we go ahead and look at the Google Earth map of the region again, Kimberly? All right, one more forward. Yeah, so you'll see here that we're looking kind of northeast of Kartitsa. It is towards the west, but we would consider this a little bit central for the area. And because of where it's located, there is actually a little bit more marl here as well, and some sandstone. Do I remember that correctly, Roberto? Do you want to tell us about the soils of this area? Oops, you're on mute.
I told you. Sometimes it happens. But I mean, it's exactly correct. I mean, moderately compendant. I mean, we are still in something like a gentle hills, but the presence of this marl with not that much rocky soils, I mean stones, can create just a little bit of how can I say, not really stable hills. So what happens is during rains, the water moves through the soil and creates something like an unstable situation in this part of the appellation. So it seems to be strange, but the ban of use of glyphosate here has started probably 40 years ago. I mean, just because they could not use weed killers, just because they risked lots of erosions. Here in this particular site, they have to be really careful in terms of on maintaining the soil where it is, just because it's really dangerous, because we have no rocks underneath that holds the hills, so we have to be as much as possible careful. They have a certain but limited quantity, for example, of free carbonates, but the soil in this place are really deep. As I told you, with not that much skeleton, just to give you the idea. It seems that this part of the appellation is one of the more fragile in terms of stability. That it was what create also the difficult for the managing. And as you can understand, we cannot move in this area with massive machines, just because the pressure that you can create with the machine can just try to move the soil from where it is to somewhere else, you know. I mean, from up to down, as it always happens. But the thing is, it's really a fragile contest. Just to give you an idea, here probably we have a significant amount of woodland because in some places it's really, really difficult to cultivate. So
yes, Kimberly, are you able to go back to the vineyard photo? I know you had a question just come in, but so just so we can really see, you know, what Roberto's describing, because if you look through this photo, you can see this really textured landscape where there's almost a plateau and then a drop and then a slope and then a drop and then an uplift. And again, that's partially because of the how movable this land is. But if you look into the details of this photo, notice it's all grass covered. It is all terraced. But as Roberto was describing, this is a region described, you know, the idea of no-till viticulture is very hip right now in the United States as part of the conversation. The DOCG area has been defined by no-till almost since its inception. And because, as Roberto was describing, it's actually really important to leave grass or cover crop between the rows to help prevent erosion. And that's also part of why it was a natural choice to eliminate herbicides and specifically glyphosate, because it's actually part of the integrity of the region to maintain that sort of ground integrity and cover crop to help prevent erosion really across the region. And that's one of the defining, this part of the DOCG helped make it like especially visible how important that was, but the region as a whole realized this is essential for all of us to do. So if we go ahead and look, one more thing to note about this particular wine, if we could go ahead and go to the wine slide. The Marceret is unique in that it's actually one of the few north-facing vineyards in the region. A very, very high proportion, a great majority of vineyards in the DOCG are essentially south-facing or southeast or some aspect connected to more southern position. But this particular vineyard is actually north-facing. And so what they found was that the, you know, the kind of round, blooming yellow fruits that we got in the first two wines, they found here, this particular vineyard site consistently gives what they were describing more as green fruits, not necessarily underripe, but if you just think of firm fruits in sort of a green flavor spectrum. And so as a result, they made a unique choice for Prosecco in that, generally speaking, the focus for fine Prosecco is very much on cultivating aromatics. But Marceret realized actually their first intention is to cultivate the character of the site that they're working with. And in this particular case, because of the unique growing conditions facing north, the site character was focused more especially on sapidity, or that kind of mouth stimulation that the wine naturally gives. And so rather than trying to just let it hang longer, which they realized wasn't helping to create further aromatics, they said, no, we're going to let this site do what it does. What it wants to give us is sapidity. And so there certainly are aromatics here, but the character of their wine, I think, is very much about that palate stimulation, or as they call it in Italy, the sapidity of the wine. You'll notice here too, though, that this is, we've moved to Brut classification here. And I want you to note the RS, but just hold it in your pocket for a second. We'll talk about that more as we continue into the next wines. Roberto, is there anything else though that you want to add about this part of this kind of north central area around this area?
I mean, can we please, Kimberly, go back to the picture that shows this area?
Or the photo, yeah. No, the photo of the vineyard.
Sorry, the photo of the vineyard, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, great.
This one, yeah.
No, back.
Back to?
For the Marceret, right? This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one. If we consider this picture obviously we can see a significant amount that seems to be really flat in the middle, but consider that the area of Guya is the majority, I mean, of the area of Guya is more similar to the things that are on the left, from middle to high, up to the church. You can see the tower, the bell tower up there. The majority of the things are made in this way. I mean, these are typical vineyards, and obviously you can see the limit of the growing of the growing of the vines, because up to that you have normally woodland. I mean, you can have woodland because the soil is really steep, you can't cultivate, or you can have woodland in the southern facing hills up to a certain level. I mean, that's the only thing I want to complete.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. The other thing to note about this particular vineyard is that the vine age averages around 50 years of age. And so because of when, and you'll, again, if you think back to the regional map, it's relatively remote as well, this part of the DOCG. And so the vineyard is unique in that it actually includes some portion of Verdeso, which is one of the 7 varieties that's allowed to appear in a vineyard blend for the DOCG, up to 15%. So the DOCG requires 85% be from Glera, but up to 15% can be some mix of these these vine types that are historic to the region. And in this case, there's some amount of Verdeso, but they admit that they don't know how much because of when the vineyard was planted and the age of the vine. It's hard to tell now which is which. It is definitely far, far less than the 15%, but they don't know exactly how much. So that is unique to the area. And then again, because it is so far north and it really is in these folds of the region, it's very influenced by the mountain temperatures, and so much cooler in this area as well. So let's go ahead and look at the photo for the 4th wine.
I was just going to say, Elaine, really quickly,
Yeah.
do we maybe want to hear from Roberto on Deborah Grossman's question having to do with the impact of climate change?
I was thinking we could actually keep that at the end, if that's okay. Yeah,
that's totally fine. Yeah,
just so we can talk about the wines, and then that's a big topic, so it'd be good to talk about
Good point.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right, next wine. So here we are, vineyard wise. Do you want the wine slide, Elaine, or are we good?
No, let's wait on that. Now, so this is actually an interesting area as well, Fara di Saligo. So we're tasting from this area with the last wine. Notice how incredibly textured it is. We'll have Roberto talk about it in a minute. And if we could go back to the very first map, the regional illustration, we can show, yes, here. So you can see there, Adami is pinpointed there towards the bottom on the yellow line. Yes, there. And so that's the area Fara di Saligo. You'll notice it's just a little before the curve of the DOCG line. And if we go to the next map, that one. It's just past the E. So again, it's still close to one of the this kind of folds of the mountains area, but now on the southern part of it and a little bit further east. So the 3rd wine was from, again, the same kind of spine of the region, but on the northern facing area. And now Fara di Saligo is kind of southern facing and a little bit further east. So if we could go back to the vineyard photo.
The illustration?
No, the vineyard,
okay,
the photo for the vineyard. Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. There we are.
There we go. Great. So Roberto, you could, thank you. Tell us about the soils and character of this area.
As you can understand from the picture that Kimberly showed you, one of the places where the vineyard that you have in your mind, I mean, the regular vineyard squared with really straight lines, this is not the place. Okay, so just because, as I told you, the rocks that holds this kind of hills give you one only way to plant this vine. So you can just follow the natural contours. So the condition is, the effect of that is the properties are really, really small. So if we take in consideration the picture, every position where you can see a little bit more green, just because this picture is obviously, this image is obviously after, just let me say, half October, end of October. So every line that you can see, it's more green. It's something like a border between a property and another. So the condition is really super variable. So in these places, the rocks that holds all the vineyards is made of conglomerates that are something like different kinds of things that has been pressed under the sea and then came up in the centuries. So these conglomerates are really, really rigid, are really stable, and in the same time creates another problem because they create the steepness. If the steepness is so high, as you can see from the picture, the thing is that you have to maintain as much as possible the grass, not only in the rows, I mean, exactly everywhere. So the only way to manage this vineyard is, for example, you have to cut the grass with the weed whacker. I mean, there are no other possible option. And because you have to maintain this 1.5 to 2 feet of vegetative soil, which can give you the possibility to cultivate the vines, because otherwise the risk of this place is to have only woodland. I mean, which is not a risk, but in the southern faces where the people in the past planted the vines decided to cut the grass. I mean, from the Second World War, they decided to have really small houses where to stay for the time needed to complete the managing of the vineyard, and in the same time to cut the grass, to give the grass to the cows that were in the house, I mean, in part of this house, and then to cultivate in the same time the vines. Just because in that period the area was really, really poor. And in order to maintain this kind of stability, in terms of, not in terms of rock soils that holds the vineyards, but in terms of vegetative soil that is underneath of, I mean, up to the rocks, in order to maintain that, they needed to manage the vineyard in this way. You have to consider, obviously, that even in this condition, we have from 600 to 800 hours per hectare for the managing. So it's an incredible number that probably will never be paid enough, because it's really, really difficult to work in that conditions. From in terms of water content, these soils are also really poor, because during summer you can see some, in the entire hill you can see some yellow dots around, because the leaves are turning from green to yellow. And the only thing to do, and what the grape growers does, is to use manure as much as possible as a fertilizer. Obviously, this can be done every year, because the vineyards, the shape of the vineyards don't give you this option, just because you have to put them all manually in each single line. And going back to the condition of the vines, I mean to the age of the vines, you have to imagine that these vineyards are not all old or all new, just because no one that is mentally sane, I mean, can redo a vineyard like this, because there are no options. You have the same shape, the same form of the hill. So the only thing to do in this condition is to replace the vines that are dying. And if you replace a vine that is dying, you have to use a baby vine, which has that much of roots. So you have to irrigate that. So it's a nightmare. Sometimes
Yes.
sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, it's great. So this area, again, because it's on the southern part of those mountain folds, this area again receives a little bit more of the breeze influence, but you'll notice. Go ahead.
Because if you consider how the hills are shaped, I mean, they are approximately from northeast to southwest. I mean,
Yes.
And this is exactly the direction of the main wind that you girls signed on the map, which is called from Has Bora, which comes from the Siberia and blows in our direction. Mm-hmm. So this kind of wind is always blowing. I mean, I know with this steepness, probably the humidity will never stay in the vineyard, and I'm pretty sure that there are no paddles on the on the hills. But even if we consider that are some moments in the season where it rains, because in the northern here part of Italy, it rains significantly. I mean, we are somewhere around 1,200 millimeters, which is
I think it's 50 inches. I wrote that down because I knew I had to translate it. I think it's 50 inches for the year.
Yeah. Which is a significant number if you compare what it rains in some of your places. I mean,
yeah. So just for context, Santa Barbara County and Central Otago both get 13 to 16 inches of rain a year.
Yeah, we have something like 3 times during.
Yeah, the DOCG gets 50 inches of rain a year, mainly in the spring and the autumn, right?
Yeah, the problem is that if we go back and we want to partially to test the condition of climate change, I mean, what has changed in the last 20 years is the position and the period of raining. I mean, we have, in the past, we had light rains, but let me say longer in terms of time. Now we have really short rains, but really energetic and in terms of quantity. So one of the things that we are trying to care as a consortium is to maintain as much as possible stable the soil, because we don't want to have erosions. Otherwise, we lose part of the possibility to cultivate the vineyards. Then for sure, we want to continue to do our job for long, just because, believe me, I'm working in these vineyards. I started working with vineyard with a friend of mine in '96, and the wines changed, became better and better and better every day. I mean, every year, sorry, and there are lots of people that wants to work really hard, as you can understand from the picture. But what has happened is these guys are really scared about the climate change and what the climate change created for them.
Yeah, it's a concern really everywhere. But when a region is this unique, it shows up in specific ways that that have to be dealt with. And we'll keep talking about that more in a second. But the last thing I want to point out in this photo is you'll see there is fog in the distance, and that the elevation in this area is actually high enough that it's kind of above that cloud layer. And so what you see in the region is that the lower elevation portions of the region have a slightly bigger change in temperature between daytime and nighttime. And as you go up in elevation, the temperatures are a little bit more even. So the influence of the fog at the lower elevations, again, it cools everything down at night. That slows down respiration of the vines. But then once the fog burns off, you get higher daytime temperatures. So you get a bigger change in temperature daytime to nighttime. So if we could pop to the wine slide for this particular wine. So this is the Adami. It had, and one of the things that James mentioned, I want to be sure to clarify, these are all vintage wines. The DOCG wines are bottled by vintage. These are all 2019. One of the other questions that came up though is, again, the focus on freshness informs how bottling is done. Because it's a pressure controlled tank, as Kimberly was describing, the wine can be held basically in stasis, so to speak, in the pressure tank. And so then the wines are bottled as they're needed. And so if you look at the back of the Adami, you know, the front of the bottle, you know, gives the vintage designation 2019. And then on the back label, you also see a stamp. And in some different wineries will use different types of stamps, but the Adami is telling us that this was bottled in July of 2020. Lug, that's Italian for July. So it's bottled July of 2020. And then there's a reference to essentially the what's it called? The order, the case, like the set that was bottled together. So the other wineries, they give a different kind of reference. They have, you know, there's 2019 is stamped for Maseret, and it's a kind of a lot number. That's the number I was trying to think of. So different wineries designate it differently, but these are all vintage 2019 wines, but they were bottled relatively recently. And again, that's part of the interest on freshness that we've talked about. So notice in this particular wine, again, this is an extra brut. The extra brut designation became official in 2019. Some of it was simply because there's, you know, it would be easy to say it's simply a matter of fashion, is why the extra brut designation was allowed. But in actuality, I would say the fashion is not just about style, it's actually about language, in that it's become fashionable to call things extra brut. Some people are making wines with lower RS or lower claims of RS at least more readily these days because there's more interest in extra brut. But if we can go back, notice the RS level on this wine, 4 grams per liter, bottled as extra brut. The extra brut typology allows for 0 to 6 grams per liter to count as extra brut. Brut classification has always been 0 to 12 grams. Okay, so notice that the extra brut overlaps with the allowable level for brut. What that means is any producer, if they fall below 6 grams, they can choose if they want to bottle as brut or as extra brut. Either one works. So if we could go back to the wine slide for the Maseret. Notice this wine is bottled as brut, but it is also 4 grams per liter. So this wine has consistently been made with an RS level of 4 grams per liter. And it has always been bottled as brut because the classification allowed 0 to 12 grams. But it is actually the same RS level as the Adami. The Maseret, I was asking them about this, and they said that going forward, they do intend to also bottle extra brut. So it's just that in 2019, the new typology emerged, allowing this us to label things differently. But the winemaking it's less that the winemaking is changing and more that there's a public interest in the language extra brut in that specific reference. Kimberly, do you want to add anything to that point? Oops, you're on mute.
That's the t-shirt I want to get. You're on mute. No, absolutely. Sorry. Yes, I would say for sure that, you know, trending globally, we see, you know, with diets and trainers and health, a lot less sugar. And I think that this category is going to enjoy a brisk appeal in the US and other markets. And it's something that we see not just in the category of wine. You know, we see a lot of nutritional labeling and caloric labeling and sugar content, et cetera, happening in wine. And we're a long way off, but I think that this sort of advancement is a really wonderful way for people to, you know, to engage with the wines at a point where they're comfortable.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to, you know, point out too, if you taste back and forth between the Masserette and the Adami, there you have the exact same RS, 4 grams per liter. But there really is a difference in character, I think, and you'll recall the soil type is actually quite different. If we want to advance again to the Adami, very, very different soils and growing conditions. There is some clay conglomerate topsoil where the Adami is, but as Roberto was describing, immediately underneath that is profoundly hard, very compressed rock. And so that limits the vigor and the root depth. And so, but importantly, the Adami is in a southern facing vineyard, which means it gets more sun exposure, whereas the Masserette is in a northern facing vineyard that is also exposed to the colder temperatures in the mountains. So there's a real difference in ripening, which then affects the flavor profile.
I definitely found a sort of counterintuitive, you know, extra floral and fruit component to the Adami that I wasn't expecting. But of course, the southern exposure supports that.
Well, that's part of why I think, like, as wine professionals, it's so important to keep reminding ourselves to retaste for the wine in the glass rather than what we have learned to expect from the label. Mm-hmm. I just, you know, and that's part of why I intentionally chose to taste from dry to extra dry, brut to extra brut, because as soon as you change your tasting order, as tasters, we have to pay attention more directly and really ask, what are we tasting and where is it coming from? And I just think with wines like this, where we're learning so much about how very site expressive the DOCG can be, the more we can do to really shake up the assumptions that we have been given about this category, the better. And so that's the other motivation to answer Jeff's question in terms of reversing the tasting order. So I think we can drop out of the PowerPoint, and we have kind of covered the material, but if there's any last questions that anybody has, especially for Roberto, you know, we can stay on a couple minutes to answer those. But otherwise, I hope everybody's enjoyed the tasting and the material that we tried to cover, really digging into the site expression for the region.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks so much to both of you for this. And I'm checking to see if there are any further questions coming in. This has been really illuminating and thought-provoking, and I can't wait to go back when I'm not having to multitask and, and really appreciate these wines even more profoundly. But you really helped us dig deep.
So again, really play with how, you know, the nice thing about doing this kind of early in the day is that you have a whole day to taste test these alongside different foods. Really give yourself permission to play with that. The first 2 wines especially are so great with salty cheeses. Again, think savory with salty foods like fried rice. Really, really perfect for the dry. And then that kind of mid-tier, again, risotto starts to work really well, or some kind of firm white fish. And then the last 2 wines, I think, they obviously they're great shellfish wines, but I think there's actually even more flexibility to them than that. And I just think the more we can play with how they show up on the table, the better, because that's the great secret for the DOCG. These are food wines. These are meant to be enjoyed with a meal, and they have profound flexibility. But I really love the kind of delicate, subtle presentation that they all offer too. I think that's the other, going back to the question at the beginning, how do we define fine wine? And what is this, what insight does the DOCG give us about what fine wine is? In my mind, aromatics, as we described, really help define the Prosecco Superiore DOCG wines from Valdobbiadene through Conegliano. But that sense of length, the really clean, long finish that they all carry all the way from dry through extra brut. But really that sense of fineness and delicacy. These are very much wines of subtlety. Again, going back to the counterpoint of sort of our French, sort of French interpretation, thinking about Bordeaux and Burgundy and Champagne. There's obviously a sense of fine wine across all three of those regions, but they're very much wines of strength. And I think in the case of the Prosecco DOCG, these are wines of subtlety and delicacy. And I like to think of them in relation to things like fine china or very fine lace. There's just a beautiful lacy persistence to them that I find really quite lovely. Mm-hmm. So thank you to everybody for giving us your time. And again, I hope you enjoyed.
Mille grazie.
Roberto, thank you so very much for all of your time. Thank you very much, girls.
I hope to see you guys here in Conegliano Valdobbiadene as soon as possible.
Yes.
We will walk in the vineyards and have a couple of glasses together. I hope that.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Yes. Chin chin.
Bye bye. Ciao.
Grazie. Ciao.